And this is Lieutenant...
Перед вами лейтенант Lyudmila Pavlichenko.
Lyudmila is 26 years old.
Hello, soldiers, forward to victory.
Just under 500,000 women served in the Soviet Red Army in World War II, or as it was known in the former Soviet countries, the Great Patriotic War. The most famous of them were snipers, but as far as we can tell from what Soviet records were made public after the fall of the USSR, only about 2,000 of them served as snipers on the front line, or at least those were the women who received formal training. But consider this, even if we limit ourselves to 2,000, the arguably 5 most well-known were responsible for the deaths of close to 700 Axis troops. If this is the type of content you're looking for, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and get notifications of other great and unusual content the moment it's released. The most famous Soviet woman sniper was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, a.k.a. Lady Death, her nickname during the war. An entire company's worth of Nazi invaders, all killed by one person. Lyudmila was born near Kyiv in today's Ukraine in 1916. She became interested in shooting while she was involved in a sports club as a teenager. One of the other boys in the club lauded his skill with a rifle over all the other students, and Lyudmila, who had done some shooting with her father, was determined to shut the young man's mouth. She continued to practice in private, and when she realized she was much better than the boy would ever be, she challenged him to a round of target shooting. We remember Lyudmila's name. Who the boy was is lost to history. At the start of the war, the Soviet regime was loath to send women, even those already in the army, to the front. Lyudmila was one of those women. She was helping as a sort of semi-trained nurse, but kept pestering her commander to let her have a rifle and kill Nazis. The first months of the war went very poorly for the Soviets, and eventually her commander relented and told Lyudmila she could become a sniper. The problem was that there were not enough rifles to go around. Lyudmila accompanied a male sniper into the front lines in the south of the country facing Romanian troops, allies of the Nazis. When her companion was wounded, he handed Lyudmila his rifle, one of the soon-to-be famous Mosin Nagants, and Lyudmila made quick work of 2 advancing Romanian soldiers. From that point forward, Lyudmila had her own rifle. Lyudmila's story is really famous in military history circles, and of course in the former Soviet Union. By war's end, she was training other snipers, both men and women. What's more, in the fall of 1942, she was one of the Soviet representatives on a tour of the United States and met First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Famously, the First Lady did not believe Lyudmila was an actual fighting soldier, and a sniper to boot. But after being assured that Lyudmila's story was true, the very blue-blood Mrs. Roosevelt and the working-class Soviet hero became actual friends, and Lyudmila was invited to the White House. In 1957, on her own goodwill tour of the Soviet Union, the former First Lady of the United States visited Lady Death over tea. Lyudmila became a history professor after the war, but unfortunately died at the young age from a massive stroke. During the war, Lyudmila was awarded the Soviet Union's highest award, twice. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was but one of the famous female snipers of the war, but many served with distinction and many gave their lives for their country. One of these other snipers was Natalia Kovshova from Ufa, a provincial city about 850 miles east of Moscow. Kovshova was planning on being a pilot, though the Soviet Union was not the paradise for women that its propaganda made it out to be. It was, comparatively speaking, ahead of many Western countries in the opportunities it afforded them. In the 1920s and 30s, Soviet leaders and their people went crazy for anything to do with aviation, planes, gliders, skydiving. In the famous subway stations of Moscow, many of the original mosaics depict the glories of Soviet aviation. It was a big thing. The Soviets were actually the first to form a paratrooper unit. Natalia wanted to be a pilot, and she and her best friend Maria Polyanova were on the waiting list to get into an aviation school when the war broke out in June 1941. After some months as a spotter in a Moscow air defense unit, Natalia and Maria enrolled in the newly formed 528th Rifle Regiment and went through sniper school. During the Battle of Moscow in the late fall and winter of 1941 to 1942, Natalia and Maria, who acted as Natalia's spotter, were on the front lines and soon ran up kills estimated to be in the triple digits. When the battle for Moscow abated, the duo became sniper instructors for a short time. But in August 1942, they were sent to the area of Novgorod, where an intense battle was brewing during the Nazis' strong push in the south of Russia and Ukraine that summer and fall. The two friends and their comrades were involved in heavy fighting in the trenches, but eventually the Germans overpowered the Soviet positions. Wounded before their arrival, the two brave women decided to wait until the Nazis entered their trench and approached them. When they did, Natalia and Maria blew themselves and many Germans to kingdom come. No one is exactly sure, but some estimates have put Natalia and Maria's total kills at nearly 300. They were posthumously awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union in 1943. When you first search for Anna Nikolina on the internet, you'll discover a famous and beautiful Russian ballerina who was born in 1985. But there was another Anna Nikolina, a Soviet soldier with the high rank of major, who was involved in the final push to the Reichstag building during the Soviets' final assault on Berlin in 1945. Perhaps the spirit of Major Nikolina was reborn in the ballet dancer, for this female hero of the Soviet Union died in 1984, shortly before the ballerina's who was born in 1985. Major Nikolina was a politruk, the Soviet nickname for political officer. She was responsible for the morale of the troops in her unit, proper communist morale of course, and to be honest, she was also a kind of spy for the Soviet regime. Political officers kept an eye on the people, especially the officers in their units, to make sure they followed orders, were proper communists in outlook, and did not show signs of defeatism. By 1945, there was very little defeatism in the Red Army, for they were part of an unstoppable machine headed straight for Berlin, Hitler's capital. Not much is known about Nikolina's career, but we do know that she was on or near the front lines for much of the war. By the time the assault on the Reichstag building began in May 1945, Nikolina was no stranger to war, and the war on the Eastern Front in World War II was especially brutal and deadly. Some 20 million Soviet soldiers and civilians lost their lives during the conflict. What we do know is that Major Nikolina was with the unit that stormed to the roof of the Reichstag and raised the red banner of the Soviet Union above defeated Berlin. And it may be that she was the one who raised it, though others claimed the honor. The famous picture of the Soviet foot soldier raising the flag over Berlin was a staged event that happened after the original was taken down. Very reminiscent of the situation of the American Marines on Iwo Jima during World War II. Whether Major Nikolina raised the first flag or not, getting into the Reichstag after fighting through the streets of Berlin in Europe's last battle of World War II was something that should be remembered. During the Great Patriotic War, women served in all types of roles. They were nurses and doctors. They were political officers, as you have just heard. Some women crewed or commanded tanks. Others fought as simple foot soldiers. Tens of thousands played a role in one sort or another in the guerrilla war that took place behind the lines in Nazi-occupied territory, and many died a horrible death for doing so. These women, though they might not be famous today, should also be remembered alongside those who were. And one group of women was so famous during the war that the Germans gave them a nickname, the Night Witches, which the women in the unit took as more of an honor than an insult. The Night Witches was a group of Soviet female pilots, some of whom had trained before the war, who undertook nighttime bombing missions of German positions behind the lines. Oftentimes, these missions were against airfields, artillery positions, and headquarters, not simply bombing German soldiers in their trenches. That means that many of their missions were against heavily defended positions. Every single modern Soviet fighter was needed at the front. Like the tanks made in Stalingrad during the battle there, at times Soviet planes left the factory unpainted and flew off into combat. That meant that the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew in old Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes made in the late 1920s as crop dusters. The Po-2 made a unique sound, one the Soviet soldiers on the ground likened to a corn harvester or popcorn maker. They gave the plane the nickname Kukurznik, loosely meaning little one who harvests corn. Some German soldiers thought they sounded like sewing machines, others thought the sound similar to that of an old straw broom sweeping a floor, and the women who flew the brooms became the Night Witches. The Kukurznik was a two-person plane. The Po-2 could carry only 100 or 200-pound bombs under their wings for a total of about 750 pounds, or risk the wings tearing off. Additionally, they had a backward-facing 7.62mm machine gun mounted to the rear of the observer's cockpit. Not enough to fight off any serious challenge by the German planes of World War II, which is why they both flew at night and low to the ground. The Night Witches flew low to the ground until they approached their targets from the rear. These brave women would fly over German lines, turn around, gain altitude, and when they were approaching their target, would turn off their loud corn-popping engines and glide silently to the target and drop their bombs. This usually happened on dark, moonless nights, and oftentimes in the wee hours of the morning when many of their enemies were asleep or not as alert as they should have been. The most dangerous part of their missions came on the return home, for after dropping their bombs, the Night Witch pilots would then have to turn their engines back on in mid-air and make a getaway. Most times, the pilots of the attacking force would split up to confuse German air defenses, anti-aircraft guns, and planes that might pursue them. The Night Witches flew most of their missions in 1942 to 1943, when the war was still undecided and modern Soviet fighter bombers were a rare commodity. Even then, the actual damage they did to enemy positions and equipment was minimal. However, their propaganda value was tremendous, and the 588th became a legendary unit of the Soviet Red Army Air Force. The Witches and their Kukurzniks also put fear in the hearts of German troops along the front lines where they fought, coming in silently as they did from the Germans' own rear areas. Over the course of the war, many of the Witches were killed in action, but those that survived to the war's end had over 1,000 missions against the enemy. On February 24, 2022, the forces of Russia invaded the former Soviet territory of Ukraine, which has been an independent country since 1991. People throughout the world condemned the actions of Russia. One of those doing so is Olha Tverdoklibova, a 98-year-old Red Army veteran of World War II who lives in Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine. The Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that Ms. Tverdoklibova had volunteered for duty in the Ukrainian armed forces and condemned Russian President Vladimir Putin's assault on the independent country. If this is the kind of content you like to watch, please subscribe to our channel for regular new content and more videos like this one.